All right, listeners, ready to dive in. Today we're looking at something pretty fundamental to business, but it gets complex, quick. Transaction cost economics.
Yeah, it tries to explain, why companies make the decisions they do about how they organize themselves. Like, do they want to work alone? Do they partner up? Or just buy what they need on the open market?
Right. And it's not always obvious, like, what factors actually drive those decisions.
And the cool thing is, transaction cost economics, we usually call it TCE. It's not just some ivory tower theory, right?
Yeah.
You sent us some really interesting research on this, a meta-analysis.
143 studies.
Yeah, 143. To look at, how well TCE's predictions actually hold up in the real world. And it turns out there are some surprises in there.
That's what I love about these deep dives, We get to see how theory actually plays out. So for anyone who maybe hasn't thought about TCE before, the basic idea is that companies, they're always trying to minimize, basically, the costs that come with any transaction.
Right. And it's not just about the price tag of whatever it is you're buying.
The sticker price, yeah.
Exactly. It's all those kind of hidden costs, like finding the right suppliers, negotiating contracts, monitoring performance, making sure everyone's doing what they said they would. And even like, what happens if things go wrong? How do you deal with that?
Right, because that can get messy.
Yeah. So all those costs, those are transaction costs. And that's what TCE is trying to help us understand.
Okay, so this meta-analysis, this huge pile of studies, it looked at decades of research, basically, to try to figure out what really drives these costs, right?
Mm-hmm.
And TCE traditionally points to three main culprits: asset specificity,
Right.
uncertainty, and frequency.
Yeah, the big three.
So let's unpack those a bit,
Yeah.
starting with asset specificity. So if I need some super specific piece of equipment or, even a really specialized skill set for a project,
Mm-hmm.
that's going to kind of lock me in more, right, to that particular supplier or partner.
Yeah, that's the idea. The more specialized an asset is to a single transaction,
Right.
the riskier it is. Because if the deal falls apart, you're stuck with this thing. You can't really use it for anything else.
Right, it's a sunk cost, basically.
Exactly. And so TCE predicts that to minimize that risk, companies are going to want to handle those activities internally.
Makes sense to me. Bring it in-house, control the process.
Mm-hmm.
So did the studies actually find that?
Well, they did. But here's the twist. The effect of asset specificity on a company's decision to do that, to integrate, was smaller than a lot of researchers expected.
Oh, interesting.
It seems like companies are finding ways to manage that risk, even with those really specialized assets.
So maybe they're getting more creative with contracts or figuring out ways to repurpose things if they need to?
Maybe. Could be.
Okay, so that's asset specificity, a little more nuanced than we might have thought. What about frequency? Does that one play out the way we'd expect?
Yeah, so frequency is all about repetition. The more often you need something, the more incentive you have to figure out a way to just control it yourself, right?
Right, because otherwise you're constantly renegotiating, searching for new suppliers, all that.
Exactly. Think
Yeah.
about it like your morning coffee. You probably have a system for that, right?
Definitely a system.
Yeah. You
Yeah.
don't want to have to figure it out from scratch every single morning.
I would not be functional. So, okay, are companies actually doing that? Are they factoring in, how often they need something when they're making these decisions about their structure?
It seems like they are. The study confirmed that, yeah, managers are paying attention to frequency. They're realizing those costs can really add up over time and trying to organize themselves accordingly.
So far, so good. Asset specificity
Yeah.
and frequency, TCE, seem to be on solid ground.
Yeah.
But let's talk about uncertainty. This is where it gets really interesting.
So with uncertainty, TCE breaks it down into three main types, right? You've got volume uncertainty, technological uncertainty, and behavioral uncertainty.
Right.
So volume uncertainty, that's basically just about predicting demand. Like, how much are you actually going to need of this thing? Technological uncertainty, that's about all the unknowns that come with new technology. Like, is it actually going to work the way they say it will? What are the bugs we haven't found yet?
Right. Those unknowns.
Exactly. And then behavioral uncertainty, that's more about, can you trust your partner to deliver, basically?
Okay. Yeah, if it's a really complex task or, you don't have much transparency into what they're doing,
Yeah.
that can be a big risk.
Exactly, if it's hard to monitor what they're doing. So here's the thing. The study found that out of those three, only behavioral uncertainty consistently led to companies wanting more control. Like, they'd choose to handle things in-house, build that hierarchy, rather than going with markets or partnerships.
So even though TCE generally says uncertainty pushes towards more control, this study suggests it's a little more nuanced than that, right? It's
Yeah.
really about that trust factor. That seems to be the thing that makes the biggest difference.
Yeah, if you're not sure you can trust them to follow through, you're going to want to keep a closer eye on things. And here's something even more surprising. Volume uncertainty actually had the opposite effect.
What do you mean?
Companies were actually more likely to use partnerships when faced with unpredictable demand.
Wait, really? That seems counterintuitive. Like, wouldn't you want more control if you don't even know how much you're going to need?
That's where these newer theories come in, the ones that challenge TCE a bit. One of those is called real options theory.
Okay. I've heard of options in, like, the financial world, right?
Yeah, exactly. So in finance, an option gives you the right, but not the obligation to buy or sell something at a certain price later on.
Right. So you're basically keeping your options open.
Yeah. And if you apply that to business decisions, it's kind of like companies want to keep their options open when the future is uncertain rather than locking themselves into one structure right away.
Okay, so a partnership gives you more flexibility if, let's say, demand drops or things change.
Exactly. You haven't overinvested in resources you might not even end up needing. And the findings from this study about volume uncertainty seem to back that up. Companies seem to favor that adaptability.
That makes sense. So it's not just about minimizing cost no matter what. It's also about having some wiggle room to adjust as you go.
Hmm.
Hmm. And this is really making me think about how I approach even my own projects. But there was another theory you mentioned, right? The resource-based view.
Yeah, the resource-based view. That one kind of shifts the focus away from minimizing transaction costs and toward maximizing the value of a company's unique assets.
So not just any assets, but the stuff that really gives them a competitive edge, right? The things that are hard to copy.
Exactly, exactly. Things that are valuable, rare, hard to imitate. So the study, it found an even stronger push towards integration when assets were both specific and strategic.
Oh, so it's like if it's hard to repurpose and it gives you a competitive edge, you really want to keep that in-house.
You don't want to let those crown jewels out of your sight.
Right. So minimizing costs still matters, but it's almost like a secondary concern after you figure out how to leverage your strengths.
Yeah.
Like step one, maximize your advantage. Step two, figure out how to protect it.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. It almost seems like those two things are in tension sometimes, you know?
Like, can you have it both ways?
Right. Can you maximize value creation and minimize the costs of protecting that value?
So can you have it both ways? Can you really maximize value creation, NED, minimize those costs?
Well, the research seems to suggest that you might be able to, yeah.
Yeah.
The authors of the paper, they suggest a kind of two-step approach.
Okay.
First, you got to figure out the structure, like what organizational structure is going to best leverage your resources, to get that competitive advantage.
Right.
Then once you've got that figured out, then you can focus on minimizing those transaction costs, the ones that are associated with that specific structure.
So it's like the resource-based view helps set the strategy, the big picture. And then TCE comes in to kind of fine-tune the execution, make sure you're not losing all your gains to all these hidden costs.
That's a really interesting way to think about it. I like that. It's not really about one theory being right and the other one being wrong,
Yeah.
They each kind of bring something to the table, and it seems like combining them might actually give you the most complete picture.
I mean, this whole deep dive has been fascinating. We started with classic TCE, all those predictions about what drives transaction costs.
Uh-huh.
And then we got into these newer theories like real options, the resource-based view. They just add like whole new layers to the puzzle.
And it's really interesting because they don't necessarily contradict TCE,
Right.
A lot of times they actually kind of complement it. They help explain those surprising findings from the meta-analysis.
Like that thing about companies being more likely to partner up when demand's uncertain. That was a big one for me. Really
Yeah.
flipped the script on how I thought about risk and control.
It's a good reminder that we should always be testing our assumptions, right?
Yeah.
The business world's constantly changing. There are always new factors to consider. So as we wrap up here, what's the big takeaway for our listeners today? What should they be thinking about, especially if they're considering a new collaboration, a partnership, something like that?
Yeah. What should they be keeping in mind?
I think it's important to go beyond just focusing on minimizing costs in the short term. Think about that long-term value you're trying to create. How do different organizational structures, how do they help or hurt that goal? Sometimes a little bit of flexibility might be more valuable than trying to control everything.
And to take it even a step further, maybe think about which of your assets are truly strategic, like what really sets you apart.
Yeah. And then how can you leverage those in a way that lets you stand out from the crowd?
Find that sweet spot.
Exactly, where you're both maximizing your strengths and protecting them.
Great advice. Well, thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the world of transaction cost economics
It's been fun.
and beyond. Until next time, keep those brain gears turning.